Well, hello there to all the good people of Ohio and beyond. This is Aaron Knapp, and you're tuned into Unplugged, broadcasting without permission. This is a place where the truth gets louder and we dig deeper, and where we always remember be lawful, not awful. If you want the full stories, the documents, the videos, and everything they don't want you to see, head on over to AaronKnappUnplugged.com, my new home for every investigation, every episode, and every update. And while you're here, be sure to like the video, follow the page, and hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the truth. We're building something real here. We're building something fearless, and we're doing it together. Welcome to Unplugged. Let's kick this thing off.
Plug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask.
I guess I should put myself on the screen. So, here's the deal. We got a lot going on tonight. We're on part two, section 10, to stop the warrant and when it's turned into a seizure. But at the same time, we're also dealing with a lot of other stuff going on in the county. I just got to say that I wanted to touch on a little bit before we delve into tonight. I will say that this situation with the schools is a little crazy. We got the school district out there doing, getting calls from the local. Well, I don't know who did it, but obviously there was a bomb threat at two of the schools, and the idea here is kind of crazy. Is that it happened at in Amherst, and it happened at some schools up near Cleveland, I believe, and then it also happened at Lorraine High. Now, Lorraine High dismissed early. We put that out. Lorraine Daily put that out. The schools got on top of it really quick and got that out. So I'm super happy that all of that took place. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to touch base on that. And also, I want to touch base on the fact that there's a recall effort in Sheffield Village, or Sheffield Lake, actually, sorry, for Mr. Rocky Radiff, the mayor over there, who also happens to be the one of the members of the law department of Lorraine. Somebody who obviously I have my own issues with. But so we're going to hit back to Section 10 to stop the warrant and when this turned into a seizure. If you recall, guys, last time I was describing a lot of the stuff that kind of led us to here. How did we get to this point? And I went through the story. It was about an hour and a half of, just kind of going over all of the different things that had been done before we ever got to this point. Now, if you want to see that, please feel free to go back and check that podcast out. Otherwise, we're going to start here. So this is where the entire situation actually changed form. Everything before this point, it lives in hearings and emails and directives and arguments about authority. What happened here is different, though. This is no longer about whether the city can say something or restrict something. This is about the government and physically stopping a person and removing him from his vehicle and taking his property under color of a warrant. Now, the defense filing titled "The Defendant's Motion to Suppress, Request for a Frank's Hearing, and Memorandum in Support of" becomes the central document at this stage. And it's written in a way that strips the situation down to its constitutional basics. It doesn't rely on tone or personality or narrative. It relies on the Fourth Amendment. And the motion states in full that the seizure violated the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, applicable to the states, through the 14th Amendment and Article 1, Section 14 of the Ohio Constitution. And it anchors that claim in MAP, M-A-P-P, v. Ohio 367 U.S. 643 out of 1961. That's not filler language. That's the rule that if the government violates the Constitution in obtaining evidence, the evidence cannot be used at all. And the factual sequence laid out in the motion is where it becomes significant. And it needs to be understood step by step. The motion states that officers already knew before the roadside encounter even began that the search warrant had been obtained for the phone. They state that in their own reports. And, you know, then that was before the encounter. They say they saw me leaving and that they knew that there was a search warrant for my phone. And then they saw me commit some sort of minor infraction. The exact language matters here. It states that officers were aware before the roadside encounter that a search warrant had been obtained for the defendant's cellular phone. Well, that means that the stop didn't begin as a neutral observation of traffic behavior. It began with a known objective already in place. And from there, the sequence continues without interruption. And hold on a second. I just want to double check something. Comments. Okay. I'm going to move comments to the stage just in case anybody needs to say something. So it began with a known objective already in place. From there, the sequence continues without interruption. Officers locate the vehicle, mine. They initiate a traffic stop. They remove me from the vehicle. I asked for, a couple of different things, including a blue envelope for my PTSD, but they wanted to get me out of the vehicle, and I get it. He was threatening me with arrest if I didn't get out of the vehicle. They knew what they were doing. So they conducted a pat down. They seized the phone from my person. And each one of those steps is a separate constitutional event. And each one must be justified independently under the law. And the state's position, as described in their motion, is that the stop was based on an alleged traffic violation, specifically failure to signal and an improper turn. Or it should be a lane change. But because I was turning left, and they say that my blinker wasn't on as I turned left. And then I shifted into the right lane from Fairless to 57, which everybody does. I get it. It's not, they had, a mechanism there, I'm sure, to stop. But the stop was used as a mechanism to accomplish a pre-pen seizure of my phone. And the statement is the center of this whole section because it reframes the stop from a routine traffic enforcement action into something else entirely. And it raises the question of whether the stop was genuinely about traffic or whether traffic was used as the entry point for something that had already been decided. They knew they wanted my phone. The law that governs that question is clear, though, and already established. The motion that was filed by my attorney cites Ren v. U.S. 517 U.S. 806 1996, which allows a stop supported by objective facts, even if the officers have another motive. So they were good there. But it also relies on Rodriguez v. United States 575 U.S. 348 in 2015, which imposes a hard limit. A traffic stop cannot be extended beyond its lawful mission without independent justification. That means the court must look at why the stop started, but not just why it started, but what happened during the stop, how long it lasted, whether each step remained tied to the lawful purpose. The motion then moves to the warrant itself, which this is where the case becomes even more serious. The warrant authorized the seizure and search of a cellular phone. Now, that matters because a phone is not a limited container. It's not like a filing cabinet per se. It's a digital filing cabinet of everything. And it's a comprehensive record of communications, recordings, contacts, personal data. The Constitution requires a clear and specific justification before that kind of search can occur. The motion states that the affidavit itself supporting the warrant failed to establish probable cause and a sufficient nexus between the defendant's phone, mine, and evidence of any offense. Now, that's not a technical complaint. Under Illinois v. Gates 462 of U.S. 213 1983 and State v. Georgia 45 Ohio ST3D 325 1989, probable cause requires a fair probability that the evidence of a crime will be found in the place that will be searched. The motion reinforces this with State v. Castanola, which is 145 Ohio STD or ST3D 1 2015 Ohio 1565, emphasizing that probable cause cannot be built on generalized assumptions about how people use phones. The context makes this even more important. The state's theory appears to rely on content that was already public or already recorded through a third-party platform. The motion addresses this directly by explaining that even if the state had access to that content, it still had to show why the personal device itself would contain additional evidence of a crime. A general belief that someone uses a phone does not justify seizing it and searching that phone. The law requires a little more than that. And this is where that request for what they call a Franks hearing becomes central. The motion cites Franks v. Delaware 438 U.S. 154, 1978. And it states that an affidavit and or sworn presentation contain false statements, material omissions, and or undisclosed and inferential conclusions presented as facts. That language is precise for a reason. It draws a line between interpretation and misrepresentation. The motion goes further and identifies the types of defects it's alleging. It states that the affidavit may have included a, quote, a factual assertion that was false or misleading, an omission of information necessary to evaluate probable cause fairly, or an undisclosed inference presented as an established fact. Sorry, my allergies, I guess. It then states that the legal consequences clearly, if those issues are corrected, if false statements are removed or omitted facts are included, the remaining content does not establish probable cause. And under Franks, that entitles me, the defendant, to a hearing that, if proven, suppression will follow. The motion will then, it addresses what happens next if the court agrees. It invokes Wong Sun v. U.S. 371 U.S. 471 1963 and the doctrine of the fruit of the poisonous tree, which a lot of you, I mean, I swear, if you've watched any legal document, a movie or TV show ever, they talk about that, right? The cops talk about it's the fruit of the poisonous tree. The rule's straightforward. If the initial stop, seizure, or warrant is unlawful, then not only must the primary evidence be excluded, but also any evidence derived from it. Now, unless the state can prove an exception, such an independent source or attenuation, the motion does not stop there. It states that if the state cannot proceed without the evidence taken from the phone, then dismissal may be required as a practical consequence. That's not rhetorical escalation. That's a logical outcome when the core evidence in a case is found to be unconstitutional. What makes this moment critical is it's not just the law, it's the timing. This step occurs after a civil hearing where the magistrate stated on the record that there was not a proper vehicle to ban this access to city property. And then it occurs after the court warned that the behavior described, quote, mine, may actually rise to the level of a criminal matter, end quote. It occurs after the city was given time to identify lawful authority for what it had already done. And then instead of resolving the issue through a clearly defined legal framework, the situation moves into a traffic stop, a roadside detention, and the seizure of a phone. Now that's a shift. A directive becomes enforcement, a dispute becomes a stop, a theory becomes a warrant, and everything that follows now depends on whether each of these steps can survive constitutional scrutiny. Not in theory, but in actual fact. So when moving to the next section, which is section 11, which is about the warrants and the timing and the missing evidence problem. See, sorry, I just got these tats done and they're a little sticky. My second skin came off and I'm trying to get some new ones. So this is the point where the structure of the case stops looking like a series of independent complaints and starts looking like something built around a single piece of speech that no one can now produce in full. Now, I only see a couple of you in here, but I'm sure you moles will be watching later. So when you come, listen to this part really closely because the timeline matters and the source of the information matters even more. The additional protection orders that were filed by a particular council at large member, a private citizen whose name I won't mention, and a spouse of a public official are all tied to a single supposed February podcast where I supposedly described as a late night Facebook live broadcast. The claim is that these individuals were sent this particular live video and viewed it, but the record as it's developing points in a different direction. The available information suggests that the person who actually distributed or circulated the video was not the defendant, me, but rather an individual connected to a page operated by the private citizen that's now involved in this matter. Now, Specifically, that page, that person is a moderator associated with that page. That distinction is not minor. It goes directly to the element of who sent what to whom, which is central to any allegation that depends on communication, targeting, or delivery. That structure of the charges, however, appears to be and treat the viewing of that video as though it were equivalent to being directly contacted. Now, that's a leap that has to be tested because the law does not automatically convert public speech into direct communication simply because someone chooses to watch it after the fact. Particularly when the distribution path runs through third parties. Now, I see two people in my feed right now. Some of my videos get a lot of views, some of them don't. But I blocked a lot of the people that were problematic or that were taking offense to my videos, so they can't even see them anymore. Now, sure, there's other ways to get to them, but I find that most people in Lorraine don't seem to go around that bout. That's why they can't get this Facebook video, whatever it may contain, because it was deleted. It was a lie. They even admit that I deleted it. From the facts referenced in the warrants themselves and the supporting materials, it appears that the video in question was deleted shortly after it was created. It is described as a, quote, Facebook live broadcast, titled in a way that suggests it was informal, late-night content. That matters because Facebook live content's not always permanently stored, folks. We all know that. As Garen will point out, they delete after 30 days, and he gets mad because now he has to save them on a different way. That's why his YouTube's full of these, different little links. But if it's deleted, which it was, apparently, recovery becomes dependent on platform retention and cooperation. The warrants, however, appear to operate on the assumption that the phone would contain the video or a copy of it. The defense's position on this, my lawyer's position, is clear to this point. The phone that was seized did not record that video, and it didn't. And more importantly, the phone itself was new as of March 1st, 2026. Brand new iPhone. They took less than a few days, less than a month after I got it. It was weeks, like a week or two. That timing is critical because if the broadcast occurred in February, as they claim, and the phone was replaced at the beginning of March, then the data that might have been existed on that prior device would not be present on the new one. And emotion points us out in substance. Even if it wasn't in those exact words, the practical reality is straightforward. If the video was not created on the phone and the phone did not exist at the time of the broadcast, then the seizure of the device cannot legally produce the original content the state is attempting to locate. And then there's the issue of what happened to the prior device. The record indicates that the previous phone was traded in, which it was, meaning any data that existed on the device would have been removed from the defendant's phone. From the defendant's possession and potentially wiped or recycled in the standard course of that transaction. That's not speculation. That's how device trade-ins function in practice. At the same time, the state has taken steps to obtain the video through other means. The record reflects that law enforcement reached out to Facebook in an attempt to recover the content. That step is significant because it acknowledges something implicitly. It acknowledges that the video is not readily available through the defendant's device and that the third-party recovery is required. And yet, despite those efforts, the prosecution has not produced the video. That absence matters more than anything else in this section. The entire structure of multiple protection orders and multiple charges appear to rest on a single piece of content. And that content is described. It is referenced. It is characterized. And it is used as the basis for legal action. But it has not been produced in a form that allows the court to evaluate it directly in its full context. Instead, what exists are fragments, descriptions, interpretations, pictures, and references to portions of that content. Well, that creates a serious evidentiary problem for the state. The court's being asked to assess intent, tone, and meaning without having the complete underlying material in front of it. And I can only assume that because they haven't provided me with that exculpatory evidence yet, or my team. The law does not operate comfortably in that space, folks. If the video cannot be produced, then the court is left with secondhand descriptions of what was said, how it was said, and what was meant. That's exactly the type of situation where context becomes critical because isolated statements can be interpreted very differently depending on who and what surrounds them. Now, this ties back directly to the warrant issue discussed in our prior section. The warrants appear to have been issued, at least in part, on the premise that the phone would contain the evidence of that video. I mean, they claim the phone is part of this criminal device. But if the phone didn't record the video, and it did not exist at the time of the recording, and does not contain the content being sought, then the factual basis for that premise becomes questionable. The result is a case that is trying to build itself around evidence that may not exist in recoverable form, while relying on devices and methods that it cannot logically produce it at all. Like, that's not a minor gap, that's a foundational problem. And it leads directly to the next section, because once the evidence is uncertain, the focus turns to people who swore to its existence. The officers, like Mr. Officer Galinas, who built the probable cause warrant and statements all around, and whether what was presented to the court as fact was actually fact or something else entirely. And that's kind of where we're at. We get to this section 12, the warrant, there's missing affidavits, and what happened after the defect was pointed out. Before we move on to that next section, I'm going to do a quick pause for station identification. So please bear with me and I'll be right.
And his name is John C.
Here at Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, we like to thank our sponsors. We have a few unofficial sponsors tonight, and they are definitely not paid sponsorships. I want to throw out there a big thank you to Joseph Jones and Eric Jones of the Lorraine Daily and the Vermilion Daily. They have a local news page. You should check them out. They do plenty of great work broadcasting all the news that is the news that you want to have in Lorain and Lorain County. So check them out. Also, please, if you need any legal services, feel free to reach out to Robert Gargas. You can find him listed online. He's a fine attorney and comes highly recommended by yours truly. And last but not least, I want to mention DNC Radio. Please make sure you check out one of the up-and-coming internet hip-hop stations and all of their shows. They put on a lot of shows. You have the Never Outdone show. You also have the Eric Bowen show, Speak Up, Speak Out. So please make sure you guys check them out as well if you're looking for your latest and up-to-date hip-hop artistry. Thank you for tuning in. This has been a non-paid sponsorship. Alrighty, guys. Thanks for hanging in there. So, this is where things get a little weird. I mean, well, look, let's just be honest. This whole thing's weird. Anybody that's watching knows that the city of Lorain is just attacking me. I get it. I asked for this multiple times when I was at City Hall. I said, why don't you guys just arrest me? Because once they arrested me, they gave me access to everything I needed without having to pay for it, without having to fight for it. Everybody hates my guts. Everybody talks, oh, you said this in the back of the car, that in the back of the car. Look, man, I wasn't on my meds in the back of the car. I identified with everything I identified with, and I stand by what I said. I don't believe I was being racist, sexist, or homophobic. First off, just because I asked someone for a reach around or a kissy poo on the cheek doesn't mean I'm being a homophobe. Homophobes don't like that kind of stuff. They would never ask for that. In fact, to act that way would be tricky for someone that's a homophobe, I would think. No, what I was doing was that those that are smart know I was doing a Cartman bit. Like, oh, I'm sorry, can we stop at Casa de whatever on the way home? Well, why is that? Well, because, I like to at least, be fed a nice dinner before you decide to F me. And that was the joke. But everybody took it another way. Now, sure, I called Chief Fallon black for a reason, because I thought Chief Fallon was going to be like the savior. I thought he was going to come in here, the first African American chief after a racist chief, and was just going to be, I don't know, maybe my expectations were too high. Obviously, they were, and so that's what I was pointing out. And yeah, I said some shitty stuff in the back of that cop car. I saw that Wagner sticker on their car, which they use and they advertise. I don't have a problem with Wagner. He's a veteran, and he was a veteran long before he was a police officer. And that's where my respect comes from him anyway. And I do believe that no matter what, he would not be okay with what was happening to me at that moment. No veteran's going to be okay with another veteran being locked up over his speech. No veteran. And if you are a veteran and you're okay with what happened to me, I have to seriously question if you're just being an asshole. And that's fine if that's all you're doing. But it cracks me up that everybody that wants to be an asshole wants to hold me accountable for being an asshole. You're just mad that I'm good at it. But we roll into this section where they're fucking with me. Like, let's just be honest. And they have this warrant and there's no affidavit. In the warrant, it says there's an affidavit. Now, one of the problems at the stop that I'm still questioning, that I've actually made a complaint about, is that the officer that first stopped me, he was in an unmarked car, kind of beat up. It's one of their little SUVs they use for undercover work. And he hit the lights and I saw it. And so I pulled over immediately. And he gets me out of the car, says, it's because for his safety and all this. And he does a pat down for his safety. Of course, I don't have a weapon on me. And I couldn't. I think they thought I might be carrying, because what they said was, hold on. Oh, yeah. But what they said was, they asked if I was carrying. I said no. And I said, I can't right now anyway. And so then it didn't even finish the pat down. He kind of reached in my pocket. He goes, what's that? And I was like, he goes, that your phone? I go, yeah. And he just grabbed it. He goes, LPD has a warrant for that. Well, I knew they were going to pull something funny. So I asked, I said, hey, can I see the warrant? And he goes like this. Okay, so this is his statement. His statement is, and by the way, this is my motion to recuse Judge Cook, which I did all by my lonesome. And so imagine he shows you this and he goes, here's your warrant. Now you're looking at it from right here. Here's your warrant. You can see it. Can I hold it and read it? No, you might tear it up. Look, here it is. I've shown it to you. Here's your warrant. Don't you read it? Can't you read it? No, you can't. That was the problem. Now, if his theory was correct and I were to tear it up, that would be obstruction of justice. And they would give me a reason. It would give them a reason to arrest me on spot. And I wasn't going to do that in front of my kid. I was taking her to get therapy, which we were 20 minutes late to, thanks to this unlawful stop. Well, no, I can't say that. Look, there was a traffic stop. I do believe, I'll give them that. I never slide out. That's such a tight turn there when you're turning on off of Fairless to 57. But now I cut that turn tight, even if I'm on my bike, and I don't drift to that right lane without going at least 2 car lanes and then hitting my blinker, even though that's what everyone does. So I stopped doing that. And now but that's, and so they pull me over, they get the phone, but the problem I have with this stop is that their rules, their law enforcement rules, which I keep on my page posted, clearly states what a warrant process service looks like. So does the courts. Everyone says you have to give it to me. And so what I told the officer on site, and it'll be on his body cam if he didn't erase it, it'll be on his dash cam if he didn't erase it, his front cam if he didn't erase it, and if they don't want to provide it, I may actually have a copy of it on my cameras in my truck, but may not. I don't know. I don't like to give you guys all kinds of information right off the bat, because this isn't part of that. But if your officer never gave me the warrant to read, and I had a backup camera underneath my tailgate, and it videoed him saying, you can see it, but you can't have it because you might tear it up. Well, again, as I pointed out, if I tore it up, it would have been obstruction of justice, and that would have been another crime. All they had to do was present me with the warrant. Now, unless that was the original, they said the sergeant was on his way with the warrant. I said, well, then give me the phone until the sergeant arrives for 20 minutes, until you give me the phone. So they extended this traffic stop over 20 minutes in order to get the warrant on site, which apparently they had one copy of it. They just happened to be in my neighborhood with a copy of the warrant, ready to stop me as I left. But hey, whatever. So that whole scenario was crazy. They took my phone, and I filed a case in the courts that I just recently checked in with the court Orlando to find out what's going on, because the only judge that's not recused from anything of mine is, I think, it's either Elwell or Ewers. Garen, you help me out here, John. It's Ewers, isn't it? Who's the county one? Come on, Garen. Chop, chop. Ewers or Elwell? All right. Well, it doesn't matter. I've got a motion on file with the within the court for one of these county guys to review the warrant and find out, why is my phone in Elyria? Why is it still sitting there? How long are you going to hold on to it? They haven't told me what they're looking for on it, although they've asked me for the passcode. I'm not going to just give you the passcode. That's my Fifth Amendment right. Yeah, everyone says, if you didn't do anything wrong. Well, that's not the point. I don't have to help them prove a case against me. That's what due process is about, that everyone seems to forget. They don't understand what I'm standing up for here. And just imagine, if they can do this with me, they'll do it with anybody. They'll go after the Katie Byers of the world. They'll go after, anybody that dare get on a podcast and speak a viewpoint that's different than theirs. Even Madhouse or these other places that do podcasts, we all do different pieces. Lorraine Daly comes down and puts stuff out. We just saw the Trump administration going after the people that reported on the FBI director Kash Patel for being drinking and all this stuff. So we're all about attacking the journalists who say what they say and when they say it and how they say it. But I'm very careful about what I say and how I say it. So we move into this point where everything moves out of theory and into documented action, because the search warrant's not an argument or interpretation. It's signed order issued on March 19, 2026 by the Lorain County Court of Common Pleas. Now, that's important because this is a municipal court case that every municipal court judge, Ray Ewers, yeah. Every municipal court judge in Lorain recused themselves from. They did on Garen's case as well, but on my case in particular, and I don't blame them because, they can't. How can any of these people be on my case? I've written so many stories about the municipal court. I haven't even finished the stories on the guy that just got, Mihawk that just left. I have file upon file upon file that shows that he was doing not so great of things when it comes to our justice system. Now, the courts don't want to look at it, but they know what I have. They know that Mihawk committed what I would argue is fraud upon the court and the public for over 13 years. A judge that doesn't know the difference between direct and indirect contempt and has turned the people into a revenue stream, in my humble opinion, as Tia Hilton loves to say, is a piece of shit. So Mihawk, who locked up James Mauricio for 30 fucking days, is a piece of shit. And the same judge in Freeman, who just had a mistrial after not being able to figure out that she had a mistrial, but then had a mistrial, even though she said it wasn't a mistrial, but then it was a mistrial, was the judge that kept him in there. Now, I know everyone says, Aaron, you shouldn't say bad things about these judges. Fuck these judges, folks. They're elected officials, and you know what they say about judges? Those who, just like teachers, right? They go, hey, those who can, or those who do, and those who can't teach. Well, same thing with lawyers and judges. We all know that judges are just lawyers who couldn't cut it in private practice. Prove me wrong. I've watched as your judiciary that you've elected here in Lorain has done some dumb ass stuff. So you got Swensky, who's been hypnotized twice. You got Glass and Janik, who just had to recuse themselves from my friend Nikki's case after Glass meddled in it so bad for so long. And I have my own history with her and ex parte communication outside the court. She can deny it all she wants, but she knows it's true. Just like McCann complained that I was accusing him of a felony, but he never tried to charge me for that. Why? If I'm lying to a law enforcement officer, why did he not charge me? Because he knew. You don't want to investigate that. So now I'm rolling through these judges. I just got judged. Well, he's not. All right. So I'm sorry. It's inappropriate to say he's recused. But this is enough that nobody thought I could even get filed here in Lorain. And it goes back to my custody case where I fought in the Idaho Supreme Court for over a decade. And I cut my teeth being a pro se litigant. So when he said one of the biggest things, it wasn't the worst thing he said, because the worst thing he said was actually bad, just like the worst thing that his magistrate, Barbara Butler, said was bad. You have to look at it from a standpoint of what she did. She said, hey, and I explained this in part one, moving into part two a little bit, but she says XYZ. You can't do this, but you could have, should have, and would have, and needed to do this, this, and this. And if you did this and this and this, and it was in front of me, I would say yes. But now because I said that, I would recuse myself. Well, now you have to recuse yourself from any decision in my case. But she made a decision, and she made it in my favor. She said, hey, you didn't have the proper vessel to ban Aaron from City Hall. So that means those 6 cops, including the chief, Chief Fowling, and Lieutenant Thompson, who is the original officer in McCann's case, who said that I was trespassed from multiple public buildings. He said I said that to him, which I never even met the guy. And I think he mistook me with someone else. And so those guys, the chief of police and his subordinates, his lieutenant, and whoever else was there that night at City Hall, when you guys said you were kicking me out and I left, I think that was the night that Angel's car got vandalized, and I'm pretty sure you guys wanted to blame that on me too, but I left with somebody else and went to my lawyer's house and stayed there for quite some time. So I have alibi witnesses that show that, thank goodness, because I didn't realize how the depths you would go. But you denied me entry to a public building, and a judge has already said that you did so illegally. So that means all those police officers now violated my constitutional rights. That's a 1983 case, 6 of them right there, because they had 5 officers and the chief. Argue all you want. Call me an asshole, call me this, call me that, say I'm this, say I'm that. Doesn't change the facts. So again, I've told them self-report. I want to know what kind of IA reports we've got. Hall wants to run around and talk about contract violations between him and the commissioners. Well, then he needs to start looking at real stuff too. So the court signed an order on March 19th, and they executed on the 20th. And it was signed, I think, defines the authority law enforcement claim at the moment they seize the phone. The warrant is directed to the chief of police, which is really weird, of the Lorain Police Department, and specifically names Lieutenant Kyle Galinas, along with any other authorized officers. It states that it is based on an affidavit consisting of 5 pages. 5. Sorry, wrong. The camera's right there. If you haven't noticed, I look here because that's where I'm at. But so it states that based on the affidavit consisting of 5 pages designated as Exhibit A, which is, quote, attached hereto and incorporated herein as though fully rewritten, end quote. Okay, that phrase is not optional language. It is the legal mechanism that allows the affidavit to supply probable cause. Without that affidavit, the warrant has no independent factual foundation. Now I go Lorain, and Lorain County is used to just fucking willy-nilly serving motions without fucking thought, right? But the warrant then authorizes a search of the specific residence of my home, along with a detailed description of the property. It describes everything on my property. It goes further by authorizing the search of the person of Aaron Knapp, quote, or wherever he may be located in Lorain County, end quote. That's not narrow authorization. That's a broad directive that allows execution across the entire county. The object of the search is defined as a, quote, personal cellular phones, plural, belonging to Aaron Knapp, end quote, with the stated purpose of locating evidence of alleged violations of Ohio Revised Code 2917.21, telecommunications harassment, and sections 2923.24, possessing criminal tools. That's where the warrant becomes constitutionally significant. A cellular phone is not a single piece of evidence. It is an entire digital record of a person's life. The United States Supreme Court addresses this directly in Riley v. California. And this is why I truly believe most of the lawyers in this area never read case law. Because if they did, they would know not only are they in the wrong, but they're stupid. In Riley v. California, holding that modern cell phones contain vast quantities of personal data. Therefore, they require strict adherence to the Fourth Amendment protections. That means the probable cause requirement is not relaxed. It's actually heightened in practice because of the scope of what's being seized. That warrant, the first one, assumes that the phone itself contains evidence of telecommunications harassment, or that it qualifies as a criminal tool. but that assumption must be supported by a fact, any fact contained in the affidavit. And under Illinois v. Gates, there must be a fair probability that evidence of a crime will be found in the place that was searched. That probability cannot be speculative. It must be grounded in specific articulable facts. The timeline creates an immediate problem with that requirement. The warrant was issued on March 19th. The phone was seized and obtained on, I think, the 20th. The content that appears to underlie the allegations is from a February broadcast. I'm sorry. The phone was seized and obtained on March 20th. The warrant was issued on the 19th. And the content that underlies the allegation is from a February broadcast, I think, or a January broadcast. I'm not real sure. I can't remember because I don't have that stuff in front of me because I'm not allowed to have that evidence outside of anywhere, and I don't have it. But I have a fairly endemic memory or eidetic memory, and so I can remember what I read, and I have the reports that they gave me both in jail and here of the warrants. So I can utilize those along with all the public records that now exist to formulate this case. Now, if the alleged recording occurred before the device, the phone, the iPhone, and the orange case existed, then the affidavit must explain why that device, because they said phones, right? Not a phone, not a particular phone, why that device would nonetheless contain evidence. Without that explanation, the connection between the phone and the alleged offense is not established. It's assumed. Well, that's a structural issue. The second's more direct, and it goes to the core of the warrant itself. The warrant explicitly states that the affidavit is attached and incorporated, but the affidavit, as required to validate that language, has not been produced in a manner that allows it to be reviewed at all, as it existed at the time of the issuance and execution, the time the judge saw it. Incorporation by reference only works if the reference document is physically attached and available to define the scope of the search at the moment the warrant's executed. If it's not, then the warrant is no longer particularized and it becomes a general authorization, which the Fourth Amendment prohibits. I mean, the fact that you guys don't know this, that lawyers and judges in this county are so fucking stupid that you don't know this, is beyond me. That defect was identified. And what happens next is it shifts this technical issue to something much more serious. Instead of producing the affidavit and defending the warrant as issued on March 19th, the state, i.e., the judge, I believe it was Rothgary, don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty sure it was because he's a judge on one of my civil cases. I think he was the first judge to issue the first warrant. Well, the state and Rothgary sealed that warrant and the affidavit altogether. I still have my copy of the warrant, so they can't seal that. I have a full copy of the warrant, what it says, everything. They had to give that to me. They gave it to me once I was in jail. I had a copy of it with other paperwork that they gave me that shows all the defendants and all the information I'm using to produce this podcast and other information. But the state sealed that warrant and the affidavit. The affidavit's the problem because I believe the affidavit's from Kyle Galinas or whoever it is. It doesn't matter who the affidavit's from because they can't know what's on my phone. There's zero chance. And the fact they didn't know about Riley v. California, the fact they didn't understand that you can't just broadly go after a phone like this shows me that, again, when you can't lawyer, you become a judge. So you're going to allow this to slide, right? Because you're their buddies. I mean, I don't believe that any of these people can be ethical anymore. They talk. They'll curse you out. They'll have conversations behind your back. They'll run businesses in other cities. They'll do whatever works out for them. They'll allow the county to get away with a mistrial in the Gaddy murder trial. You know, they allow the county to do whatever the fuck it wants to, and it's ridiculous. But instead of producing the affidavit and defending the warrant as issued, they sealed it. That's not neutral. It's not a neutral procedural step. It removes the very document that's required to establish the probable cause from review at the exact moment it's being challenged. So we challenged it. We said, hey, you can't say this, this, and this, or do this, this, and this. Put in a motion, told them everything that was wrong. And then after their structural deficiencies were raised, they issued a new warrant. The second warrant and its supporting affidavit have not yet been produced either. They told us about it. Yet the existence of the subsequent warrant issued after the defects in the first were identified introduces a critical question that cannot be ignored. If the original warrant was valid, there's no need to replace it. If the original affidavit established probable cause, there's no need to issue another one. A warrant's supposed to stand or fall based on the facts presented at the time it's signed. It's not supposed to be corrected after execution. And yet they still have my fucking phone in Elyria Police Department. Why? Why Elyria? Courts have consistently rejected attempts to cure defective warrants after the fact by relying on documents that were not properly incorporated at the time of the search. The reason's straightforward. The Fourth Amendment requires that the limits of a search be defined before the search occurs, not reconstructed afterwards, which is what apparently Lorraine likes to do. Here, the sequence is clear. March 19th, 2026, warrant issued, relying entirely on the affidavit that is said to be attached and incorporated. That warrant's used as the basis to seize a cellular phone, mine. The structural deficiencies in that warrant are then identified to the state. My lawyer identifies them, specifically the lack of properly reviewable affidavit tied to the authorization of taking the phone. So instead of producing that affidavit and defending it as they were required to do by law, the materials are then sealed, and that a new warrant is then issued with a new affidavit that's not been disclosed. So that's not clarification of the record. That's a replacement of the record. Once that happens, the issue is no longer limited to whether the warrant was broad or whether the nexus was weak. It becomes whether the affidavit that justified the search at the time that it occurred is the same affidavit being relied upon now, or whether material facts were altered, omitted, or reframed after the fact, which they were. And that is an exact concern addressed in the Franks v. Delaware. If a warrant affidavit contains false statements, omits material facts, or presents inference in a way that is necessary to finding a probable cause, then the warrant cannot stand. And if the only way to defend the warrant is to seal the original affidavit and issue a new one, then the integrity of the original probable cause determination is no longer intact. At that point, the question is no longer what the warrant says. The question is whether the warrant that authorized the seizure ever had a lawful foundation at all. Now, I'm coming up to a break here on this one before we move to section 14, but I want to point this out when it comes to this, is that what they did is so structurally unsound, it's not even funny. Again, if that first warrant was sealed, what was on it? What was said? You can't produce that. And if you haven't produced the second warrant that you said was issued, I've never been properly served a warrant for my phone. Well, if that's the case, then that means, as I wrote on that paperwork when I signed it, you stole my fucking phone. Why do you still have my phone? I'm a journalist. I have contact information of my sources on there. I think you wanted to know who certain people were. I think you still moronically believe that I'm Sensei Cobra, like a lot of people do, even though he put out my safety affidavit while I was in jail because of you. So if you believe I'm Sensei Cobra, like Lorraine Ritchie has said multiple times in multiple emails to multiple people, then that's on you, because I am not that individual. That guy is buried deep within the county somewhere or somewhere else, but he's deep throat. He's the one giving out the information. And he doesn't just give it to me. He gives it to every news agency in this entire county. He sends it to everyone. Everyone ignores him but me. And then when I post for his stories, because I am a little bit of a conspiracy theorist in that way, people assume I'm him, and I'm not. So that's where this all came from. Everybody thinks I'm him. I don't know if you want to find out who's him, what's on my phone, all these other things. But I guarantee you there's nothing on my phone that shows I harassed anyone. I don't go to any of your people's houses. I don't know where any of you people live. I don't care enough about any of you people. And honestly, this video that you say exists, you claim exists, that I said all these bad things about you, provide it if you have it. Otherwise, meh. And if you do have it, great. Like, I did delete whatever video was up. I did think better of what was up. So for it to be harassment, it would have to be intended. And I never intended you to get it. I don't expect you people to watch my videos. I expect people who are interested in my stuff to watch it, not people who dislike me. And the government obviously dislikes me. My own councilman doesn't respond to me. None of the council responds to me. You guys know that I have lawsuits against you, and you still took this action. That's on you. So we end up in this point where the integrity of the original probable cause determination is no longer intact, and the question is no longer what the warrant says. The question is going to be whether the warrant authorized the seizure ever had any lawful foundation. So that's going to bring us to section 14, where the state creates the burden, then asks for time to respond to it. And I'm going to take another quick break here, and we'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Hey there, folks. Aaron here at Unplugged with Aaron Knapp. I want to give you a quick reminder for everyone watching that the City of Lorain holds its regular City Council meetings on the first and third Monday of every month. And those meetings are not just for council members, they are for residents. If you care about what happens in your city, and if you speak or want to speak on an issue, ask a question, or simply be present and informed, showing up matters. Participation matters. Even sitting in the room and listening matters. You do not need to be an expert on any of this. You do not need permission to care. You do not need to do anything other than just show up. So check the agenda, folks. Mark your calendar. And if something affects your neighborhood, your family, or your future, take a seat, raise your hand, and make your voice part of the record. Lorain City Council, first and third Monday. Your city, your meetings. Those council meetings start at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they're held inside of City Hall. Make sure you attend this Monday's meeting. Hey there, folks. All my vets out there, you know this tune. That's right. Sing along. The VA hold music. Many a veteran spent his final moments listening to this very tune right before he would a bullet or OD or became one of the numerous suicides for veterans over here. So please, if you know somebody who's struggling, or if you're a veteran or you need help, reach out, call 988, call the veteran hotline. But if you are a veteran out there and you are thinking of harming yourself or doing anything, I'm not, we chat in our humor as veterans, but if you're hearing this music and that's all you're hearing because we're not picking up, my number's out there, but somebody would pick up. Anyway, that was a little sad one, but so we're in section 14 when the state creates a burden and then they ask for more time to respond to it. So what happens next is kind of in the timelines, not just procedural, it's sort of revealing because it exposes this contradiction that sits at the center of this whole case. On one hand, the court had already set the matter for a motion hearing on May 8th, 2026 at 11 a.m. with bonds and protection orders explicitly continued by journal entry on April 27th. That means that the court had already recognized that the issues raised by the defense are already to be addressed. The motions are filed, the records developed, the hearing is scheduled. On the other hand, the state files a motion for an extension of time. Now, I think it's clear to say, like, I think we need to rephrase. The initial motion was set for June, and the May 8th motion actually was one that was moved up because the court administrator was claiming there were duplicate filings because of the way that the state filed their case. And so that's why we had this moving up of the hearing to May 8th, which is this Friday. Now the state's asking for more time because they say they don't have time to respond. The records developed, the hearing scheduled. So, but then the state files this motion for extension of time, asking for additional 30 days to respond to the same motions. That alone was raised questions, but the problem becomes more serious when the timeline is placed in context because the issue of, quote, multiple filings did not originate with us, the defense. It originated with the state. Specifically, the concern about multiple filings was raised through court's own administrative and procedural channels, including actions tied to the court's administration and communications associated with the clerk's office. That concern was brought to the court in a way that resulted in movement on the schedule. The court responded by addressing the issue and moving the matter forward, resulting in the settling of the May 8th hearing date, right? In practical terms, the timeline shows that the issue of multiple filings was used as a basis to accelerate the proceedings and bring the matter before the court more quickly. That was on the state. Jordan Coughlin, I think, is the one that requested that the judge review that. Now, the court acted on that concern. The schedule was adjusted and we get this new hearing. Just so happens now that since he's going to be here, Garen's got a hearing on that date too. Now, the issue is being used in the opposite direction. The state's motion explicitly argues that it needs more time to respond because of the quote unquote flurry of motions filed by the defense, listing filings from April 20th, 23rd, 24th, including motions to suppress, requests for a Franks hearing, motions to dismiss, and constitutional challenges. The state characterizes those filings as numerous and at least implicitly duplicative. But those filings are not optional, and they are not excessive in any improper sense. They are required by the structure of the case. And I know the law department doesn't like to read these pesky things, but the prosecutors should know them, because there's a set of about 55 rules, and out of those rules, maybe 15 to 20 of them are removed. So you got about 33 of them that are active. The rest are just holder pages. But under those rules, Criminal Rule 12, defenses and objections that can be determined before trial must be raised, or they are waived. Under Criminal Rule 47, motions must state their grounds with particularity. And under Criminal Rule 51, issues must be brought to the court's attention and ruled upon to be preserved. And under Criminal Rule 55, each case maintains its own record. Now, the state chose to divide all this overlapping conduct that expands from, again, before I even get into that, it starts initial case October 20th, 2025. That's supposedly the disturbing the meeting case. Then they move forward to something in January or February with a podcast. Then they move forward to this protection order that they got for Ray, and then supposedly an email that I sent. Then they bring this podcast forward, and they get all these protection orders and this criminal tools, and they take my phone. So now you have 6 misdemeanor charges. Now, the state in Lorain City, doesn't want us to write 6 separate motions, one for each case number. And in its motions, it will combine all 6 cases, even though there are multiple incidences spread out over an entire year, which is unusual to say the least. But yet when they serve us, the defense, they give us every single case separately. So we get an order for each of the 6 misdemeanors, and we had to pay bail on each of the 6 misdemeanors. So they chose to do this, and now they're complaining because we're responding as required by their own criminal rules in each of the docketed cases, because if we don't, then the defense will not have an option of filing once and assuming it applies everywhere. The defense, us, must file in each case. That's not strategy, it's compliance. And that's the part the state's motion leaves out. Apparently, Bao skipped criminal rules day at law school because he doesn't know what they are. The same structure that requires multiple filings is the structure that the state itself in Bao's and Santiago created through its charging decisions. You charge 6 misdemeanor cases separately and together all at once that consisted from October to February, March of the next year. So October, November, December, January, February. So 5 months. So conduct 3 separate instances over 5 months equals 6 misdemeanor cases, each with a separate case number, each with a separate filing, each separate bail, each separate everything. And yet they're mad that we filed a response, even if it does look duplicative. They're required, because the same structure that requires multiple filings is the structure that the state created through its charging decisions. The same filings now being described as a burden are the filings required to preserve the constitutional rights of mine under that structure. The same issue that was used to bring the matter forward is now being used to justify pushing it back. Well, that's ignorant, and the contradiction matters, because the defendant, me, has already waived time in order to move the case forward. That waiver reflects a clear position that the issues are ready for resolution. The defense is not asking for delay. The defense is asking for rulings. Meanwhile, the state is asking for 30 additional days, not because new evidence has emerged, not because a new legal issue has arisen, but because it must respond to motions that exist precisely because of the way the state structured its own case. Wow. Huh. The effect of that request is not neutral. During the additional time, the conditions imposed on March 25th, 2026 remain in place. The bond remains in effect. The criminal protection orders remain active. The restrictions on contact, movement, and communication remain enforceable. The defendant continues to operate under those conditions without resolution or of the underlying legal challenges. And it's not about time, it's about leverage. The state accelerated the process when it suited their position, raising concerns about multiple filings and prompting the court to address them. Now facing those same filings in a posture where it must respond on the merits, the state seeks to slow the process down. That's a contradiction sitting in the record. The filings aren't the problem. The structure is the problem. And until the court addresses that structure directly, the cycle continues, where compliance is labeled as excess, preservation is labeled as duplication, and the burden created by the state is issued as justification for the delay by the state. And that's where the case stands going into this May 8th hearing. That brings us to our next section, 15. The record now shows a system under strain, not a defendant out of control. By the time the court reaches the point of the scheduled May 8th hearing tomorrow at 11 for May and 10 for Guerin, the narrative presented by the state begins to collapse under the weight of its actual record. Because what it's being described as a flurry of motions is in reality a direct and necessary response to a fragmented and internally inconsistent prosecution. I mean, facts are facts. The state's position attempts to frame the volume of filings as excessive, even suggesting they are duplicative. But the framing ignores both the procedural rules governing criminal cases in Ohio and the factual procedural created by the state itself. Each motion filed between April 20th and April 24th corresponds to a distinct constitutional issue that must be raised prior to trial or it's forfeited. That's important, folks. Those filings include motions to suppress evidence tied to the stop and the seizure of the cellular device, requests for a Franks hearing based on alleged defects in the warrant and the affidavit, motions to dismiss tied to specific charging instruments, and the motions addressing discovery violations and exculpatory evidence. These aren't repetitive filings, these are layered filings. And each one addresses a different failure point in the state's case. And each one must exist independently in the docket because the state chose to divide what it treats as single narrative into multiple criminal cases. That division carries consequences, folks. And one of those consequences is that the defense must mirror that structure in order to preserve its rights. So what becomes critical in this section of the record is that the state, City of Lorain, is now asking the court to treat the consequences of what it did by making the charging decisions as a justification for delay. The motion for a 30-day extension of time does not identify new evidence, newly discovered facts, or unforeseen legal issues. It just points back to the defense filings themselves as the reason additional time is needed. But those filings are not discretionary. They are required under Criminal Rule 12, which mandates that pretrial defenses be raised or they are waived. They are required under Criminal Rule 47, which demands specificity in motion practice. They are required under Criminal Rule 51, which covers preservation of error. And they are required, even if you skip that day in law school, under Criminal Rule 55, which enforces the separation of case records. In other words, the state is asking for more time because the defense complied with the rules that it's supposed to follow. And at the same time, the record reflects that the state has not yet produced critical evidence, exculpatory evidence, that sits in the center of its own theory. The alleged conduct underlying multiple charges is tied to a February podcast described as a Facebook Live broadcast, yet the prosecution hasn't produced the video that allegedly forms the basis of those charges. The record instead suggests that the video was not retained and that it may have been deleted shortly after it was created, and that the law enforcement sought to obtain it from third parties, including Facebook, without success. Despite that absence, the state has pursued and executed a search warrant issued on March 19th targeting cellular phones as evidence of telecommunications harassment and possessing criminal tools. The warrant was later sealed along with its supporting affidavit. That's not legal. And after structural deficiencies were identified. And a subsequent warrant was reportedly issued through the defense though the defense has never been provided with a copy of that warrant or its supporting materials. And that sequence matters because it shows the state forward or move forward with seizure first and clarity later. I always like to put my daughter's name in everything. Clarity. The record further shows that the device taken during the roadside stop was a new phone, obtained March 1st, 2026, or activated on that date, meaning that any alleged recording tied to a February broadcast would not logically exist on that device unless independently transferred or recreated. That disconnect goes directly to the issue of probable cause and nexus, which is why it's central to the suppression motion and the request for a Franks hearing. At the same time, the state is explaining the case beyond the initial protection order, involving a public official, adding additional complainants, including a council member, a private citizen, and the spouse of another public official, all tied to the same underlying broadcast. The theory remains that these individuals were exposed to the content, and therefore that content constituted harassment, despite the absence of evidence that the defendant, myself, sent it directly to them. That expansion creates another layer of complexity because it transforms a single act of public speech into multiple criminal counts across multiple cases, each carrying its own bond, its own protection order, and its own set of restrictions. The cumulative effect is not theoretical. On March 25th, multiple, recognizance entries imposed financial obligations totaling thousands of dollars, along with conditions that restrict movement, communication, and access. Those conditions remain in place as the state seeks additional time to respond to motions that challenge the legality of the very actions that created those conditions. This is where the system begins to show strain. The court is now presented with a record that contains sealed warrants, unproduced evidence, multiple overlapping cases, expanded complainant lists, and a set of defense filings that attempted to address each of those issues within the framework required by the criminal justice rules. At the same time, the state asked for delay based on the existence of those filings while continuing to rely on a structure that made those filings necessary. I mean, again, we got 6 separate motions to show when the hearing date was. So if we're not supposed to file, then why are they giving us 6 separate orders? I'm sorry, not motions. So that's a situation where that's not a situation where we're out of control. That's a situation where the record itself is out of alignment. And the court approaches this hearing tomorrow with the question is no longer whether there are too many motions. The question is whether the underlying structure of the case can withstand the scrutiny of those motions require. Because once the court begins ruling on those issues, the volume of filing stops mattering. What matters is whether the foundation holds. That's going to bring us to section 16. Now, what the law actually requires. Now, the record's fully laid out and brought forward to the present posture. The next step is not to continue telling the story, but to begin testing it against the law that it's supposed to govern. This is where the narrative shifts from what happened to whether what happened is legally sustainable. Now, at the center of all of this, at the center of it is multiple charges in this case is Ohio Revised Code 2917.21, telecommunications harassment. That statute is not a general, quote unquote, offensive speech law, and is not a catch-all provision that criminalizes criticism, insults, or political commentary. It is a targeted statute with specific elements that must be met before conduct can be considered criminal. The law requires in substance that a person knowingly make or causes to be made a telecommunication to another person with the purpose of abuse, threaten, or harass. The structure of that statute matters because it's not enough that speech is harsh or offensive or even insulting, which is what they're insinuating in my case. The statute requires that the communication directed to a person, and it requires a specific mental state tied to that communication. This is where the facts already established in the record begin to matter in a very precise way. The conduct at issue is a single broadcast, described as a podcast or a Facebook live stream, conducted in February. The record reflects that this was a public broadcast, not a direct message, not a private communication, not a targeted transmission sent from one individual to another. The record further reflects that the individuals who later became complainants were not sent the video directly by the defendant. Instead, the information was available, suggests that the video was circulated or accessed through third parties, including individuals associated with a page moderator connected to one of the complainants. The distinction is not minor. It is central because under RC 2917.21, the question is not whether someone eventually saw the content. The question is whether the defendant, me, made a telecommunication to that person. A public broadcast that is later viewed, shared, or discussed by others does not automatically satisfy that element. The law does not criminalize the possibility that someone might encounter speech. It criminalizes specific conduct directed towards a person. The intent requirement matters just as much. The statute requires a purpose to abuse, threaten, or harass. That is a higher standard than mere knowledge that someone might be offended. It requires that the communication itself be made with that purpose directed to that recipient. Here, the content described in the record by the defendant or by the plaintiffs in the record includes name calling, criticism of public figures, and individuals connected to the government. The record as it stands does not reflect threats of violence. It does not reflect repeated direct communications. It reflects a single instance of speech discussing public issues, public actors, and matters of public concern. And that's where the First Amendment begins to intersect with the statute. The United States Supreme Court has made it clear that speech does not lose constitutional protection simply because it is offensive, insulting, or critical. In Brandenburg v. Ohio 395 U.S. 444 1969, the court held that inflammatory speech is protected unless it is directed to inciting imminent lawless action, and it is likely to produce such action. In Snyder v. Phelps 562 U.S. 443 2011, the court reaffirmed that its speech. You need to go to bed, sweetie.
Can I show your people?
Go to bed, please. This is not for this. Come on. I told you I would be doing this podcast. I told you to go to bed.
I know. Tell
Yeah,
Karen
you're still
I say
here.
hi.
Yes. Clarity says hi, Karen. So the highest wrong. Oh God, see, this is what happens. The court reaffirmed that speech on matters of public concern occupy the highest the rung of First Amendment protection, even when it causes distress or outrage. And that's key here. Even more directly relevant is the requirement that criminal statutes be applied in a way that does not transform protected speech into criminal conduct, simply because it's unpopular or uncomfortable. Courts have repeatedly cautioned against expanding statutes like telecommunications harassment beyond their intended scope, particularly where communication is not direct and where the conduct involves public commentary. And that's where the structure of this case becomes critical again. The state has taken a single instance of public speech and through the addition of multiple complaints, transformed it into a multiple criminal counts across multiple cases. The count is tied back to the same underlying content. Each complainant is treated as if they were a direct recipient of a communication from me, even though the record suggests otherwise. Each charge carries its own consequences, its own bond, and its own protection order. That raises a fundamental legal question. Can a single public broadcast not directly sent to any of the complaints be transformed into multiple violations of a statute that requires a communication to another person? That question is not rhetorical, folks. It's the question the court has to answer. Because if the answer is no, then the structure of the case collapses at its foundation. The answer is yes, then the implications extend far beyond this case, because it would mean that any public speech that was later viewed by multiple individuals could potentially give rise to multiple criminal charges, even in the absence of direct communication. That's not how the statute has traditionally been applied, and it's not how constitutional protections have been interpreted, which is why I'll also be going all the way to the Supreme Court with this case if they don't dismiss it at this level, which is why I'm making sure that we get all of these constitutional arguments on file now, because they need to be on file now for the appeal. That's what I did in the Cook case and all these things. I kept saying to the judge, look, I know you're going to deny it. It's fine. Just need it on the record, because if you don't put it on the record, you can't later appeal it. If you don't ask, you can't ask later. And so when traditionally it hasn't been applied that way, and now constitutional protections have been interpreted, this is how the absence of underlying video becomes more significant. The state has not produced the recording. That allegedly forms the basis of these charges. The record suggests that the video may no longer exist, that attempts were made to obtain it from third parties, and that the device seized during the traffic stop could not logically contain the original recording due to its acquisition date. Without that content, the court is left to evaluate the charges based on descriptions, characterizations, and secondhand accounts. That further complicates the analysis because the actual words used, the context of the speech, and the manner in which they were delivered are all critical to determining whether the statutory elements are met and whether the speech is protected. By the time the court reaches this point, The issue is no longer whether I filed too many motions or my lawyer did, or whether the state needs more time to respond. The issue is whether the conduct alleged, even accepted as true, fits within the statute that's been charged. That's why this section matters, because everything that comes next depends on that answer. Also bring us to section 17, the warrant, the seizure, the probable cause, kind of just going into an analysis that moves past speech itself and focuses it shifts the focus to the government's response. And this is where the case becomes even more legally fragile, because whether the theory of the state advances about telecommunications harassment still has to support what it actually did. And what it did here was seek a warrant, conduct a stop, remove a person from a vehicle, seize a cellular device as evidence of a crime. That sequence is not minor. It's one of the most intrusive actions the government can take in a modern case. One of the most intrusive. Because a phone is not just an object, it's a container of communications, history, identity, a private life. The United States Supreme Court recognized that in Riley v. California, where it held that digital devices require a heightened constitutional protection and cannot be treated like ordinary physical evidence. So the question becomes simple from, even if complex in application, what facts justified that level of intrusion? The warrant issued on March 19th authorizes the search of the residence for the person of Aaron Knapp Me for personal cellular phones as evidence of violation of RC 2917.21 and 2923.24. The warrant states that it's based on a 5-page affidavit incorporated by reference and commands officers to execute the search within 3 days. That is a formal structure. But the legal validity of the warrant does not rest on its formatting. It rests on whether the affidavit establishes probable cause, meaning a fair probability that evidence of a crime would be found in the phone or in the place or in the item to be searched. That standard comes from Illinois v. Gates, and it's been adopted consistently in Ohio throughout cases like State v. George in 89. Probable cause is not a guess, folks. It's not a possibility. It's not a generalized belief that phones contain information. It requires a nexus, a connection between the alleged crime and the specific thing to be seized. That's where the record begins to break down. The alleged conduct is a February podcast or a January podcast, described as a Facebook Live or a podcast. I'm not sure the exact date. But the device was seized on a roadside stop, was obtained on March 1st. That's when I got it. Or right at the end of February, beginning of March, before we even got it hooked up, which means it did not exist at the time of the broadcast, was made useless, and therefore is evidence that the content was later transferred to it. There's no evidence of that, unless they can prove that. There's no indication in the record that such transfer occurred. There's no indication that the affidavit established that connection. At the same time, the state's own actions suggest uncertainty about where the evidence actually existed. Efforts were made to obtain the video from Facebook. The content was reportedly deleted shortly after it was created. The prosecution has not produced the video as part of discovery, yet the warrant proceeds on the premise that the phone would contain the evidence of that same content. Why? Why would they believe that? Am I using my phone right now? That's not a nexus. It's an assumption that Kyle Galinas made, I believe. And the law is clear that assumptions are not enough. In State v. Castanola, the Ohio Supreme Court emphasized that probable cause cannot rest on broad inferences about technology or generalized beliefs about where evidence might be found. There must be specific articulable facts tying the device to the alleged offense, and there is none. When that link is missing, the warrant fails. When they don't have the affidavit, the warrant fails. That's why we require the Franks hearing. And I don't know if I listed it in here, but we recently got a response back from them. Their argument is that, well, how would he know that the warrant's invalid? We've never given him the affidavit. So he can't prove the affidavit's bad because we've never shown it to him. You realize how fucking ridiculous that sounds? So because we didn't show it to you, there's no way you can know that it's invalid. What the fuck does that mean? That sounds like Bowles wrote it. But hey, when that link's missing, the warrant fails. The situation becomes more concerning because the procedural handing of the warrant is considered. The warrant and its supporting affidavit were sealed after deficiencies were identified by my attorney. And a subsequent warrant was reportedly issued. However, that subsequent warrant and its supporting affidavit has not been produced to the defense. That creates a structural problem that goes beyond probable cause, because a warrant that relies on an affidavit must stand or fall on what's actually presented to the issuing judge. The language used often used in warrants, stating that the affidavit is incorporated herein is not a formality, it's a requirement. The judge must be able to review the facts. The defense must be able to challenge them. The court must be able to evaluate them. And if the affidavit's missing, incomplete or not, actually attached, incomplete or not actually attached, sorry, I should have said that on a different breath, then the foundation of the warrant is not just weak, it's unreviewable. And that's exactly the type of situation that's addressed in Franks v. Delaware. Under Franks, a defendant is entitled to a hearing if there is a substantial preliminary showing that the affidavit contained false statements, omitted material facts, or presented inferences as facts, and that those issues were necessary to the finding of probable cause. The record here raises each of those concerns. There's a question about whether the affidavit overstated the connection between the phone and the alleged offense. There's a question about whether it omitted the fact that the content was publicly broadcast and not directly transmitted. There's a question about whether it failed to disclose that the device being seized did not exist at the time of the alleged conduct. There is also a question about whether the inferences about where evidence, quote, might, unquote, be located were presented as if they were established facts. Each of those issues standing alone is significant. Taken together, they are exactly why a Franks hearing and what a Franks hearing is designed to address. The matter in which the warrant was executed adds a different layer. Officers initiated a traffic stop, removed the defendant, me from the vehicle, conducted a pat down, seized the phone, and the state asserts that the stop was based on traffic violations, but the record suggests the officers were already aware of the warrant. They said it in the report. We knew of the warrant. Then we made the stop. And that raises the question whether the stop was legitimate or pretext for the execution of the warrant in controlled setting. While Wren v. United States allows that pretextual stop if there's an objective basis, the protection disappears if the asserted traffic violation is not supported by the facts or the intentions extended beyond the lawful scope. That's Rodriguez v. United States. All these issues converge on a single point. The warrant lacked probable cause if the affidavit was defective, if the stop itself was unlawful, then the seizure of the phone is unconstitutional. And if the seizure is unconstitutional, then everything that flows from the subject to suppression under Wong-Sun v. United States, that doctrine commonly referred to as the whole fruit of the poisonous tree. That includes not just the phone, but any data extracted from it, if they got any leads developed from that data, if they got any additional evidence derived from those leads. This is where the stakes of the case shift. Because up to this point, the focus has been on whether the speech itself can support the charges. Now the focus is whether the government's response to that speech can survive constitutional scrutiny. And if it can't, well, then the case doesn't just weaken, it collapses. Woo! All right, that brings us to section 18. Holy crap, what time is it? It's 11:20. All right, we're going to take a quick break here. I'm going to get a glass of water, and we'll be right back to continue and maybe finish this up if we can get to it. We're going to be moving into section 18 as the record, as it actually applies to this case. And this section will remain focused entirely on facts, documents, and procedural evidence or events that directly relate to me and the charges that are pending. When the record is properly limited in that way, what remains is not a broader historical narrative, it's defined. And the recent sequence of events that begins in March and moves forward in a structured and traceable way. And the starting point is that March 19th. And so we're going to continue right there on March 19th, right when we come back. Thank you for staying tuned, and I'll be right back. Here at Unplugged with Aaron Knapp, we like to thank our sponsors. We have a few unofficial sponsors tonight, and they are definitely not paid sponsorships. I want to throw out there a big thank you to Joseph Jones and Eric Jones of the Lorraine Daily and the Vermilion Daily. They have a local news page. You should check them out. They do plenty of great work broadcasting all the news that is the news that you want to have in Lorain and Lorain County. So check them out. Also, please, if you need any legal services, feel free to reach out to Robert Gargas. You can find him listed online. He's a fine attorney and comes highly recommended by yours truly. And last but not least, I want to mention DNC Radio. Please make sure you check out one of the up-and-coming internet hip-hop stations and all of their shows. They put on a lot of shows. You have the Never Outdone show. You also have the Eric Bowen's show, Speak Up, Speak Out. So please make sure you guys check them out as well if you're looking for your latest and up-to-date hip-hop artistry. Thank you for tuning in. This has been a non-paid sponsorship brought to you by Unplugged with Aaron Knapp.
Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polish decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polish decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap.
Sorry. Anyway, welcome back, folks. This brings us to, as I said before, section 18. Now, the starting point of the record in this area is March 19th, 2026. That was the date the search warrant was issued by the Lorain County Court of Common Pleas, directing law enforcement to search my residence located at Talbot Lane for my person for cellular phones. Phones, plural. The warrant specifically states that it was supported by this affidavit consisting of 5 pages. It says attached here to designated as Exhibit A, but there was no Exhibit A. The warrant further identifies the alleged underlying offenses as RC 2917.21, telecommunications harassment, and RC 2923.24, possessing criminal tools. The phone, apparently, is criminal tools. The warrant commanded execution within 3 days. So they executed, I think it was on a Thursday or a Friday, but they had 3 days to get it done over the weekend, whatever, and they authorized officers to seize any cellular phone believed to be evidence of those offenses, any cellular phone. So apparently I had multiples when I only had one. That document's not just procedural formality. It's the legal format or foundation for the seizure of my phone. Everything that followed depends on whether that foundation was valid, complete, properly supported. Within less than a week, on around, I think it was March 25th, the record shows a significant escalation in both the number of proceedings and legal restrictions imposed. On that same day, multiple criminal protection orders were issued under RC 2903.213. Each one of those orders imposed identical conditions. Each order restrained me from contact, prohibited electronic communication, imposed a 500-foot distance requirement, and included firearm restrictions tied to federal law. Each order also expressly states that it functions as a pretrial condition in addition to any bond imposed under Criminal Rule 46. You know, those rules that the prosecution doesn't pay attention to. And at the same time, recognized bonds were entered across multiple case numbers. One bond reflects a $10,000 obligation tied to the charge of violating a protection order under RC 2919.26 or 3113.31. Additional bonds of $2,500 were imposed for separate counts of telecommunication harassment. Another bond in the same amount imposed for possessing criminal tools. These were not consolidated into a single proceeding, right? Instead, each charge was assigned its own case number, its own bond, and its own procedural track. That's important because it directly affects how the case must be addressed and litigated. Even though the charges arise from overlapping facts over an 8-month period, the decision to divide them into separate cases requires that the defense treat each one independently for purposes of motion practice and issue preservation. So what you're calling multiple motions, duplicate motions, yeah, it's the same motion 6 times in a case because we have to file it in each case and address it. Otherwise, we don't get to address it on appeal, and you can fight us on that. You know it, we know it. But by April 27th, the court entered journal entries into multiple cases numbers, setting all the matters for a single motion hearing on May 8th, 11 a.m. in courtroom CR2 before Judge Mark Comstock. Now, each entry follows the same format. Each confirms that the bond remains in place. Several specifically state that the protection orders remain in effect. And each case, although separately docketed, is scheduled to be heard at the same time and in the same courtroom and in front of the same judge. This reflects a practical reality that the court itself has already acknowledged. Although the cases are formally separate, they're being treated as interconnected for the purposes of pretrial proceedings. That acknowledgement is not theoretical. It reflects directly in the scheduling orders. But at the same time, the state filed a motion for extension of time where it characterized all of our filings as a flurry of motions and requested an additional 30 days to respond. And that motion specifically lists filings that were made in the later part of April, including motions to suppress, requests for that Frank's hearing, motions to dismiss, and discovery-related filings. The state's position is that the volume of these filings require additional time to respond. However, that request must be understood in context. The issue of multiple filings and overlapping proceedings has already been identified prior to that request. The court, through its administrative process and scheduling adjustments, has already moved to address the existence of the parallel filings by setting a consolidated motion hearing, which we're assuming is this May 8th thing. In other words, we're asking them at the same time as well that the structure requires multiple filings is already being recognized, and the court needs to be told or recognize that it needs to take steps to manage it. Now, the state's request for additional time, therefore, is based on a condition that's already been acknowledged by the court administrator, who's addressed that through having this May 8th hearing to address the procedural framework of the case. And when the structure of the changes is viewed as a whole, a consistent pattern emerges. There are multiple charges, multiple complainants, multiple protection orders, and multiple bonds, all tied to overlapping facts and the same general course of conduct. The cases proceed under separate case numbers, but they all rely on the same underlying events. Supposedly, this spread over an 8-month period because it was 3 separate events. The same investigation, the same categories of evidence, the court's own scheduling decisions confirm that reality. And even when the formal structure of the cases remains divided, they're still sending out 6 different orders to appear to me for each case at the same time. So while the state's motion may have all those cases listed, at the same time, the orders are separate. And that's precisely why the issue of the procedural clarity has become central. Under Rule 12, Criminal Rule 12, those pesky rules that apparently Bulls miss rules day, defenses and objections must be raised before trial, or they're subject to waiver. That means if we don't say it now, we don't say it ever, for those who need it in layman terms. Under Criminal Rule 47, motions must be stated with particularity within the case in which the relief is sought. So under Criminal Rule 51, issues are preserved only when they are raised and ruled upon. Because each case remains separately docketed, those rules require that the motions be filed in each case to ensure that no issue is lost. That requirement doesn't arise from strategy. It arises from the structure imposed by the state's charging decisions. At the same time, the rules of criminal procedure also provide mechanisms for coordination. Criminal Rule 8 permits joinder of offenses arising from the same conduct. Criminal Rule 13 allows the court to order cases to be tried together. Criminal Rule 17.1 allows for pretrial coordination to promote efficient resolution. And Criminal Rule 57 allows for, I guess there are more than 55, sorry. Rule 57 allows for the court to proceed in any lawful manner that's not inconsistent with the rules. The existence of all these provisions underscore their current structure is not inevitable. It was a choice, and it was a choice that carried procedural consequences made by the state. As that case stands now, the posture is clear and current. The warrant has been issued and executed. The phone has been seized. Charges have been filed across multiple cases. Protection orders remain in effect, and bonds have been imposed and continued. A unified motion hearing is set for May 8th. I'm assuming that's what it's going to end up being. And the state has requested additional time to respond to all of my attorney's filings. And my attorneys filed motions that directly challenge the legality of the stop, the seizure, the warrant, the structure of the proceedings themselves. And that's where the case stands right now today. The next step tomorrow is not another expansion of the timeline. The next step is a narrowing of the legal analysis. The focus moves directly to the stop, the detention, the seizure, the phone, the validity of the warrant under the 4th Amendment and Article 1, Section 14 of the Ohio Constitution. The questions that follow are no longer procedural. They are constitutional, and they concern whether the stop was lawful, whether the seizure was justified, whether the warrant was supported by probable cause, and whether the absence of withholding the supporting affidavit determines the validity of the entire process. And that's where this case turns. And that's what the court ultimately will be required to decide. When you look at the warrant and the seizure and the warrant as a single event, and that's where our next step is going to be, everything tightens and becomes decisive, because this is no longer about structure, scheduling, or how many cases exist. It's about one continuous law enforcement action that has been artificially broken into pieces, but must be analyzed as a single constitutional event. The stop of my vehicle, the removal from the vehicle, the pat down, the seizure of the phone, the execution of the warrant, that had already been obtained are not separate legal moments. They are one sequence. And that law requires that sequence to be justified at every step. The state cannot isolate one piece and ignore the rest. The court cannot evaluate one stage in a vacuum. The entire claim stands or falls together. The pre-planned nature of this stop, and the record already establishes that something critical. Officers knew before initiating the traffic stop that a warrant existed for my phone. Not a critical, and it's not a minor detail, it's a fact that changes the entire analysis. Because when law enforcement sets out to locate a specific individual for the purpose of executing a search warrant on that person and uses a traffic stop as the mechanism to accomplish that goal, the court's required to examine whether the stop was actually supported by the objective independent facts. And I go back into Wren v. United States here, but it's important to understand they never gave me a ticket. That shoots them in the foot. Never once was I given a traffic ticket that day. They just, when they were done taking my phone and giving me the warrant, they let me go. So if there was no underlying traffic stop that you charged me for, then you screwed it. The pooch, that is. Under Wren v. U.S., an officer's subjective motive does not invalidate the stop if it's an objectively valid traffic violation, which it was, apparently. However, that principle only applies if the violation actually occurred and is supported by the evidence, which it doesn't. Because if the asserted basis for the stop is not supported by the facts, because they say clearly they saw me leaving, pulled in behind me, another vehicle moved, it put them directly behind me. They said they saw I didn't have my blinker on, and that's why they stopped me. But they claim they knew they had a warrant for my phone before they stopped me. So the state claims the stop was based on traffic infractions and a failure to signal or an improper lane change. But the observations occurred in a manner sufficient to justify the stop. Sure, whatever. The dispute is not secondary. The constitutional checkpoint. If the stop fails at that point, everything that follows is subject to suppression. The scope and duration of the detention, even though if the court were to assume that the sake of the argument that the initial stop was valid, the analysis doesn't end there. The detention must remain tied to the purpose of the stop, and it cannot be extended beyond the purpose without independent justification under Rodriguez v. U.S. A traffic stop becomes unlawful if prolonged beyond the time reasonably required to complete its mission unless there is separate reasonable suspicion to justify the extension. In my case, the mission of the stop was not traffic enforcement. The mission was to seize my phone. And that's what the officers were there to do. And the question becomes whether the detention was used as a tool to execute the pre-existing plan rather than a response to a legitimate traffic violation. If the stop was prolonged, which it was, in order to give me the warrant that they finally gave me 20 minutes later, or structured in a way that served a pre-existing purpose, which it was, rather than the traffic purpose, which I never got a ticket for, that becomes a constitutional problem. The seizure of the phone is central act in the case. Everything the state hopes to prove flows from that act, and the warrant authorizing the seizure of the personal cellular phone becomes belonging to Aaron Knapp, quote, as evidence of alleged criminal violations of RC 2917.21 and RC 2923.24. That language is broad, but it's not unlimited. It depends entirely on whether a probable cause existed to believe that my phone contained any evidence of those offenses. And that's where their warrant and their affidavit become critical. The warrant claims that probable cause was established through an affidavit consisting of 5 pages incorporated into the warrant as though rewritten fully here. However, the issue that I'm raising and my lawyer's raising is that the affidavit has not been produced in a form that allows meaningful review, and that the warrant itself does not have independently established facts necessary to support probable cause. That creates a structural problem because under Illinois v. Gates, again, and State v. Georgia, again, the issuing judge must have a substantial basis for concluding that probable cause exists. That conclusion must be based on separate facts, based on specific facts, not assumptions, not generalizations, and not undisclosed inferences. And if the affidavit is not available for review or it fails to establish a clear nexus between the phone and the evidence, then the warrant cannot stand. That's the nexus problem. The state's theory appears to be that my phone may contain evidence related to the Facebook Live broadcast or similar content. However, the theory raises a fundamental question. If the alleged content was publicly broadcast and others recorded or viewed it independently, then what specific evidence was, presented that make it likely that this would be found on my physical device, my cell phone, that was not already, my cell phones that was not already available. Probable cause that was not available through other means, but probable cause requires more than the possibility that the phone might contain something. It requires a fair probability that the evidence of the offense would be found on that specific device, and that's what Mr. Galinas, in all his infinite wisdom, apparently forgot. that under State v. Castanola, the Ohio Supreme Court made it clear that probable cause to search a digital device cannot be based on generalized assumptions about how people use phones. There must be a concrete, fact-based connection between the alleged offense and the device to be searched. And you don't have that here. I know you don't, because I didn't use that fucking phone to record that video. So if that connection's missing, the warrant fails. And if the warrant fails, you guys are fucked. And you're going to pay. But the fraction of the warrant process, like identified as a second equally important issue here, is that after that initial warrant and structural deficiencies were raised, the state sealed the warrant and the affidavit. Said, no, you're not going to get it. And then issued a new one that we haven't been given as the defense, or the supporting materials that would allow to us evaluate that one's validity. Not to mention the fact that it creates a serious problem of the integrity of the whole process, because a warrant cannot be retroactively repaired. It must stand or fall based on information presented by the issuing judge at the time it was issued. So if the deficiencies existed in that moment when they put that first one out, they cannot be cured after the fact by sealing the record and replacing it with something new. And that's not subject to that is not subject to challenge. That's why that Franks hearing under Franks v. Delaware is required and exists. On top of that, that's why I filed a separate motion in the civil court to require them through Judge Ewers to give me my phone back. So that brings us to section 20, and I think we're getting closer to the end here. I might be able to make it to the end by midnight. So we're going to take one more quick break, and then we're going to fight our way through. Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. From city council and school boards to local businesses, community events, and neighborhood stories, these outlets cover what the big media ignores. This is hyper-local news for real people in real communities. Visit Lorain Daily and VermilionDaily.com today. Read it, share it, support local journalism, because your community deserves coverage that actually lives here. Hey there, folks. DNC Radio is your home for real conversations, real community voices, and independent radio that doesn't answer to the corporate filters or political scripts. From music to live talk, community issues to uncensored discussion, DNC Radio is powered by the people, not the algorithms. If you're tired of sanitized media and ready for something real, tune into DNC Radio. You can follow and listen right now at Facebook.com/DNC Radio OH. That's Facebook.com/DNC Radio OH. DNC.
Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask.
All right.
Unplug with Nap.
Welcome back there, Lorraine. Good late evening there, Lorraine. Anyway. I forgot to do that at the beginning as I usually do, but the warrant, the affidavit, the omissions, and the Franks problem. And this is the point where the case stops being about sequence, folks, and becomes about substance. Everything now turns on what was actually presented to the issuing judge. I think it was Rothgary in the very beginning. And now we've gone through a couple of different judges and a couple of different issues because, again, the muni court judges have recused themselves. And Rothgary is my civil court judge on one of my cases. And Cook's now at least pending the outcome of this hearing in the Supreme Court and reviewed by the Supreme Court Justice, I think it's Stone. It is imperative that everybody understand how that's going to work, because everything now turns on what actually presented to the issuing judge and the warrant was obtained and what was not presented, and whether the difference between those two things matter. Because under the law, the difference is not academic, it's dispositive. A search warrant is only valid as the information used to obtain it. If the information is incomplete in a material way, which it is, or it presents inference as fact, which I'm sure it does, or it omits facts that would have changed the probable cause analysis, then the warrant is subject to a challenge under the Franks hearing. Frank v. Delaware, 438 U.S. 154, 1978. That's not an extraordinary remedy. Look it up. It's the mechanism the courts used to test whether the warrant process was reliable. and what the warrant claims versus what is actually available. The warrant in this case that is supported by a 5-page affidavit that we've never seen, and the affidavit that's incorporated into the warrant that we've never seen, as though fully rewritten. That language is standard, but it carries specific legal consequence. It means the issuing judge relied on the affidavit to find probable cause. However, the problem here is not what the warrant claims exist. The problem is that what actually has been produced, what hasn't. The defense got provided with some stuff, but not a complete reviewable version of the affidavit that allows us to test the factual assertions and the basis for the assertions and the logical steps connecting those assertions to probable cause. And at the same time, we've identified that the original warrant and affidavit were sealed after structural deficiencies were raised by my lawyer. That's a problem. That's the biggest problem of all. And that a subsequent warrant appears to have been issued without providing the defense any access to the underlying materials. And that gap in the record, and it's a huge gap, it's not minor. And because a reviewing court cannot defer probable cause determination that cannot be meaningfully examined. The premise of judicial review depends on transparency of the basis of the warrant. And the 4 categories of Frank's defects. Now, I also want to point out, if I may not do it before I remember, the big issue is here, I believe it's under Criminal Rule 4, everything must be recorded, transcribed, and the warrant was issued in a process that wasn't recorded by the court, which automatically is probably going to disqualify everything because they didn't do it. I think it was under Criminal Rule 4. But under Frank's, the analysis focuses on whether the affidavit suffers from one of 4 types of defects. Each one has been identified in our motion. The first category is a false statement presented as fact. This occurs when the affiant includes a factual assertion that is not true and does so either knowingly or with reckless disregard for the truth. The second category is a material omission. This occurs when the affiant leaves out information that would have been necessary for the judge to complete and evaluate a probable cause. And the omission does not have to be intentional in the sense of bad faith. It has to be enough that the omission was made with reckless disregard for what the judge was being given as a complete picture. And the third category is the presentation of the inference as if it were established fact. That's particularly important in cases involving digital evidence, as officers may infer that a phone contains certain data, but that inference must be disclosed as an inference. So if it's presented as official fact or certainty, the judge is deprived of the ability to independently evaluate the reasoning. And the fourth category is a mismatch between what the affiant actually knows and what is communicated to the judge. This includes situations where the affiant compresses, simplifies, or reframes information in a way that materially changes its meaning. Any one of these defects, if material, is sufficient to trigger the Franks hearing. Now, the materiality requirement, not every error in an affidavit results in suppression. The law requires that the defect be material to finding a probable cause. That means the court must reconstruct the affidavit in one of 2 ways. If the claim that makes the false statement was included, the court removes that statement and asks whether the remaining content still establishes probable cause. And if the claim is that the information was omitted, the court adds the information back in and asks whether probable cause still exists when the affidavit is viewed as a complete and accurate document. If after that reconstruction probable cause no longer exists, the warrant fails. That's the standard set out in Franks and applied in Ohio throughout cases to State v. McKnight and State v. Castanola. The digital device problem that they have is that the case involves a cellular phone, which raises an additional layer of constitutional concern. Because as I've said, phones are not like other items. They are repositories of vast information and vast amounts of personal information that the law requires a heightened level of specificity when authorizing their search and seizure, which this court did not do by saying, seize all cell phones. And the Ohio Supreme Court has made clear that the probable cause to search a phone cannot be based on general assumptions about how people use these phones. There must be a specific fact-based connection between the alleged offense and the data expected to be found on my device. There's no way. If the affidavit simply assumed that because a person was involved in an alleged offense that their phone must contain the evidence, that's not enough. If the affidavit relied on the existence of publicly available content but did not explain why the original device would contain additional or different evidence, that's not enough. And if the affidavit failed to account for the fact that the alleged content may have been created, deleted, or stored elsewhere, that omission becomes critical. Because the structure issue with the sealed and replaced warrant is critical. The issue that we're raising regarding the sealing of the original warrant and the apparent issuance of a subsequent one goes directly to the integrity of this whole process. A warrant must stand on the information presented at the time it was issued, cannot be corrected after the fact by replacing it with some new version that's shielded from review. Because if deficiencies were identified in the original affidavit, those deficiencies must be addressed through the Franks process, not through the retroactive modification. The absence of the affidavit from the record prevents meaningful challenge, and that alone supports the need for the Franks hearing. Without access to the affidavit, we can't move forward to test the accuracy, completeness, or the reliability of the statements as they were used to justify the seizure. And at this stage, the case is no longer about what might have happened. It's about what can be proven within the constraints of the Constitution. If the affidavit shows or is shown to contain materially false statements, omissions, or undisclosed inferences, the warrant's invalid. If the warrant's invalid, the seizure of the phone's invalid and unlawful. And if the seizure is unlawful, all evidence obtained from the phone and all evidence derived from the phone must be suppressed. And if the state's case depends on that evidence, the case does not proceed. And that missing video is key. The failure of the state's evidentiary foundation at this point is the stage of the case. The focus shifts away from what the state alleges towards what the state can actually produce as evidence. The distinction between those two is critical. Changes and the charges in this case are not based on a pattern of conduct over time or a series of independent events. They are based on a single alleged piece of content described as a Facebook Live broadcast titled as NSFW Late Night Bar Chat, which the state claims occurred in or around February or January. And every charge, every warrant, every protection order, from the most part, and every procedural step taken by the state flows from that single alleged broadcast in this matter. You still have the October 20th disturbing a meeting charge, and then the subsequent supposed violation of a protection order against Ray Carrion through a supposed email, the same guy that assaulted me after a city council meeting. But hey, that's fine because words hurt. But they have these three separate incidences, but all of these protection orders, except for that one individual, the safety service directors, actually stem from this podcast that they supposedly got sent. Now, if that foundation is the foundation of the case, and that foundation does not exist in a form that can be proven, then the case itself cannot stand. As the record currently exists, the state has not produced that video. That absence is not minor evidentiary issue. It's a fundamental failure of proof. In a prosecution alleging telecommunications fraud under RC 2917.21, the content of the communication is the core evidence. The statute requires proof of communication made with a specific purpose, such as to abuse, threaten, or harass. Without the actual communication, the court has no ability to evaluate the words used, the context in which they were spoken, and the tone of the speaker, or whether the statutory elements were satisfied. There is no substitute for the communication itself. Testimony about what someone believes they saw or heard cannot replace the actual content when the content is the basis of the charge. The record further indicates that law enforcement attempted to obtain the video from Facebook. It's in their motion. That fact alone raises a significant question about what evidence existed at the time the warrant was sought. So they didn't have the video. Then the assertion that my phone contained evidence of that video required a factual basis that must be clearly stated in that affidavit. And without that factual basis, which we know Galenas didn't provide because they would have given us the warrant with the affidavit. The warrant rests on speculation, what will be there, rather than probable cause. And because nobody bothers to read the law, especially the police around here, the timing of the phone seizure introduces an additional and equally important issue. The phone was seized as was newly acquired on March 1st, 26. Established the device was taken by law enforcement was not the same device that I would have been using at the time of the alleged February broadcast. And if the original device was traded in or replaced, the state was required to explain why the new device would contain the evidence of an earlier event. And that explanation is not optional. It's required to establish the necessary nexus between the device and the alleged offense. So probable cause cannot be the basis of a generalized assumption that the person's current phone might contain evidence of past conduct. It must be based on specific facts showing a fair probability that evidence will be found on that particular device. The record also reflects that the alleged video was deleted shortly after it was created, per their own words. The affiants, or at least the witnesses or the people that are claiming these protection orders, have claimed that it was deleted. At least one of them has stated it was deleted. It may or may not be recoverable. I don't believe it is. It was alive. It was done, late night, and I deleted it later, or it got deleted after the 30-day thing because Facebook shifted the way they store live videos. It was never a podcast. It was just a live video that I did after I got home from the bar one night. So, however, the mere fact that the content was deleted doesn't establish probable cause to seize a different device at a later date. It requires a factual showing that the data still exists in a recoverable form on that device, the one they have right now, the brand new iPhone that I got in March. To be seized is likely to contain it. If the affidavit doesn't address those issues, which it doesn't, it says seize any phones, that it failed to provide the issuing judge with the information necessary to make an informed probable cause determination, and that fact and that type of omission is material under Franks v. Delaware because it directly affects the validity of the warrant. The method by which the alleged video was viewed by the complainants precedes another critical issue. The record as described indicates that the video was not sent to the complainants directly by me. They state that. Instead, it appears that the content was accessed or distributed through third parties, including a moderator associated with the page, by one of the complainants. That distinction is legally significant because under 2917.21, harassment requires a communication made to another person. A public broadcast later viewed by someone through a third-party distribution chain is not the same as direct communication to the individual. And the statute requires an analysis of who the communication was directed to, how it was transmitted, and whether the defendant, myself, acted with purpose required by law. If the communication was not directed to the complainant, which it wasn't, then the statutory elements are not satisfied. When those facts are considered together, the state's theory becomes internally inconsistent. The state asserts that the video exists and that it forms the basis for the charges. At the same time, the state has not produced the video. Law enforcement sought the video from Facebook, suggesting that it was not in their possession. They clearly state that they sought it from them and they haven't heard back. The phone was seized, was not a device used at the time of the alleged broadcast. The video was reportedly deleted shortly after it was created, and the complainants did not receive the video directly from me. So each of these facts undermines the state's position. Taken together, they create a structural failure in the evidentiary foundation of this case. This matters because the state bears the burden of proof, not me. It must establish not only that a communication occurred, but that it met the specific statutory requirements of the offense alleged and charged. Without that video, the state cannot establish what was said. Without establishing what was said, it cannot establish the intent. And without intent, the charge of telecommunications harassment cannot be sustained. In addition, if the warrant was based on the assumption that my phone contained that video and that the video was not on the device, and not likely to be on the device, then the probable cause supporting the warrant is called into question. And if the warrant fails, the seizure of the phone is unlawful. The seizure is unlawful, then any evidence obtained from the phone and any evidence derived from that seizure must be suppressed under Wong Sun v. U.S. Although there's nothing on there to suppress. It was a brand new phone. Like, I haven't even connected that phone to iCloud or my old one, to be honest, because when I got this new phone, I ended up with an iPhone saved that God must be from when I was in freaking college, like in my, whenever I got an iPhone, I don't know, 30s or whatever, because it's got like, high school reunion emails from, my 10-year high school reunion in it. And all of this stuff came up in my phone record now. So when I have to look at my phone now, the phone I have, I get all these old emails and these contacts that don't even exist anymore. Because I never, like an idiot, never uploaded my phone to the iCloud. So none of that stuff has ever been saved on iCloud. It's all been deleted. It's all gone. And I'm stuck with whatever phone list I have now. Thank God I don't know many of those people and don't really contact many people. But at this point, it's no longer about their allegations. It's about whether the state can produce the evidence necessary to support those allegations within the framework required by the Constitution of the U.S. and Ohio. And next, we're going to move into the absence of evidence that examines how the state structured these changes across multiple cases, multiple complaints, and whether the structure reflects separate legal claims or an attempt to divide into a single set of facts. Now, the multiplication of charges and the structure of those proceedings at this point of the analysis, the focus moves to the absence of the central place of the evidence by the way the state has structured the case itself. What emerges from the record is not a series of independent events giving rise to separate prosecutions, but a single course of alleged conduct that has been divided into multiple cases and carrying its own charge, although it actually is three separate courses of content. But because it's the October 20th meeting, then it's whatever happened at that podcast. It's also the Ray Carrion email, supposedly. But it all has legal consequences, and those consequences directly affect fairness, burden, integrity of the process. And the record shows that multiple misdemeanor cases were filed, including counts for telecommunications harassment and counts for possessing criminal tools, which is my phone, and a count for violating a protection order under RC 2919.27. Each of those charges has assigned its own case number. Each resulted in separate bonds, including a $10,000 bond for alleged protection violation order and multiple $2,500 bonds for the other charges. Each case proceeds on its own docket, despite the facts that they're all tied in overlapping facts. And at the same time, the court has already acknowledged the interconnected nature of these cases by setting them for this motion hearing. And then scheduling that decision reflects a practical reality that can't be ignored. The cases are separate in form, but they are unified in substance. And that dual structure creates a procedural imbalance. Procedure, specifically Rule 12, Rule 47, and Rule 51, the defense is required to raise and preserve all issues within each individual case. Failure to do this risks waiver. That requirement is what has necessitated the filing of parallel motions. And those filings are not duplicative in any nature in an improper sense. They're compelled by the structure of the proceedings. At the same time, the state has treated these cases collectively when it's advantageous for them to do so. The state filed a single motion referencing multiple case numbers. The court scheduled a unified hearing. The underlying facts, the witnesses, the alleged conduct are all shared across cases. This creates a situation in both where all cases are treated as both separate and unified depending on the context. And that inconsistency is not procedural. It also has real consequences. By dividing what appears to be a single course of conduct into multiple cases, the state has imposed multiple bonds, multiple protection orders, multiple layers of legal exposure. The criminal protection orders issued on March 25th under RC 2903.213 each contain identical restrictions, each prohibit contact, electronic communication, and proximity within 500 feet. Each functions as a pretrial condition, and they all arise from the same general set of allegations and are enforced simultaneously. This creates cumulative restrictions that go far beyond what would exist if the conduct were addressed in a single proceeding. The same is true of the charges themselves. Telecommunications harassment requires proof of communication made with the purpose to abuse, threaten, or harass. If the alleged conduct consists of a single broadcast, a single set of statements, then the question becomes whether that conduct supports multiple independent charges or whether it constitutes a single act of being charged multiple times. The law doesn't permit for that kind of same conduct to be multiplied into multiple offenses without clear basis. The court must examine whether the charge requires proof of fact that the others do not, and whether each charge is based on a distinct act or a distinct communication. If the charges are based on the same act, the same content, the same course of conduct, then the risk of improper duplication is real. The inclusion of charges possessing criminal tools further highlights the issue. That requires proof that a device was possessed with the purpose to use it criminally. My phone was not possessed to use it criminally. That's stupid. If that's the case, then everybody that has a phone is using it criminally. If you post a TikTok video where you say something, you're using your phone criminally. That's just dumb. But if the alleged criminal conduct is the same communication that forms the basis of the telecommunication harassment charge, then the question becomes whether the device itself can be treated as a separate offense or whether it's simply part of the alleged act. These aren't abstract questions, and they don't go directly to whether the state has properly charged the case. They do go to whether they've charged the case or whether it's expanded and a single allegation into multiple proceedings. The record also shows that the charge for violating a protection order was added tied to an earlier temporary protection order, and that change appears to be based on an incidental communication occurring on the same day the order was served. The addition of that charge introduces a different time frame and a different legal theory, but is still being litigated alongside the other charges, further contributing to the overlapping structure of this case. Taken together is where we're at. The structure of the proceedings creates a situation which a single narrative being advanced across multiple cases, each reinforcing the others, each carrying its own penalties. It's requiring independent defense filings. This is precisely why the issue of procedural clarity and coordination becomes central to the court that has the authority under Criminal Rule 13 to order a joinder of cases that could have been brought together. The court also has authority under Rule 17.1 and Criminal Rule 57 to manage the proceedings in a way that promotes fairness and efficiency. That authority exists to prevent exactly this type of fragmentation when it risks creating confusion or unfair burden. The importance of all of this is that it reframes the case as it actually exists rather than as presented on paper. And in multiple cases, there are multiple cases in substance. There is one set of facts being litigated in multiple forms at the same time. And that distinction matters because the law requires the court to ensure that the proceedings are not only technically correct, but fundamentally fair. And fairness requires that the charges reflect distinct conduct and restrictions are proportionate to the allegations. And the structure of this case does not create an artificial multiplication of exposure. So this will be the last part of what I do tonight. I just want to thank you guys for tuning in. There is a little bit more, but most of that's going to be the practical effect of these overlapping protection orders and everything else. And I think a lot of this will be easier explained tomorrow after the hearing. We have a little bit more clarity on what's going on. But all you need to remember in the meantime is that they've tried to string these little events into one big long criminal hearing. They've separated it into multiple cases. And how can individuals in the Lorain Law Department still be involved in a case where, like in Bowles' case, the assistant prosecutor, I've made fun of this guy, the way he dresses, called him a redheaded stepchild, made fun of him in a meeting where we were trying to get records and he wasn't giving them to me. I've sang songs to this moron. And he's already lost to me in other cases where I kicked his ass in that Cook case. And now you're going to put him on my criminal case? You guys don't see that as a problem? That's not some sort of conflict of interest. You're going to put this podunk ass first year lawyer against me? That's just fucking mean, to be honest. You guys are really fucking this poor guy. But I figure what you told him was, even if you take some sanctions off this case, we'll take care of you for 2 or 3 years. And when you come back, you'll still be part of our merry little band of fucking ignorant legal lawbreakers. So you guys want to keep this up? That's fine. We'll see you tomorrow in court. But none of this is going to stick. You think you've done me harm, but in reality, you just gave me what I wanted. This criminal case gives me the ability to get all the records I want. I noticed you shucked out of the civil case today and giving us the rest of those records that directly relate to this criminal case that you don't want to provide exculpatory evidence on, while you're attacking my lawyer in different areas. And Kyle Galinas is going after my attorney just like he went after me, as he did on the behalf of McCann, just like he went after Dennis Flores. You guys don't see this as a problem for you? Lorain PD can't even investigate me. These dickheads shouldn't be looking at me in 1 minute.
Call me when you're done.
So the bottom line is that I feel like they can say all they want all day long. They violated my civil rights. They knew they did it. And now this case is going to depend off of whether they can prove that they didn't just do what Butler told them to do, the magistrate, and then what Cook then backed up. They went to Rothgary and got another protection order for carry-on. Then they got Rothgary to sign a criminal protection order. Then Rothgary and his magistrate had to hold off because of the criminal proceedings that they were directed to do by the magistrate, Barbara Butler, in Cook's court. And she did direct them exactly to that. I have the transcripts were submitted to Catherine at the Supreme Court, the head of the Supreme Court of Ohio. They have all these documents. They have my affidavit that clearly states what was stated and how it was prejudicial to me, and shows how the county and the city have coordinated their efforts in what I believe to be a very unlawful way. And now, yeah, sure, you may not like me. You may think I'm an asshole. You may say all these bad things in the back of a police car. I don't give a fuck. None of this is reflective of that. I did that so I wouldn't die in that stupid, dirty-ass jail. And for the record, after spending any time in that jail, I'm just going to say, any bonds that the sheriff asks you to pass, I don't care. Fucking do it, for God's sakes. Because if they're going to keep throwing innocent people in that jail, the best thing we can do is at least make it safe. Because the cell I was in was not. It was gross. It was nasty. There was shit smeared on the roof. But at least it had a video camera. And as long as I got up every 3 or 4 hours to yell and beat on the glass, that video camera would see me and see me alive. And then I wouldn't have to worry about whatever was going to happen there. But beyond that, they wanted to parade me in front of everyone. They got all of this video out the very next day, and I've got plenty of records requests in. I want to know what they've been charging the Chronicle. I want to see all the requests that the Chronicle made for my videos, why they gave them the back of the videos, why did they try to embarrass me, why did they put out all of this stuff, why did they poison the jury pool, why. So we're going to leave off at section 23 because honestly, I see here I've got, let's just see. Where does it end at? It kind of ends at like, I think 25 or 26, somewhere in there. But the problem is we do have this big hearing tomorrow. So we'll tune back in this weekend after the, after 23, we'll do 23, 24 through 26. And then there's a final. But I think that will all change based on tomorrow's hearing. So tune in next time. Same bat channel, same bat time. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys next time. You guys make it a wonderful night. This has been AC Nap here for Nap Unplugged, and I appreciate you tuning in and listening to what I had to say tonight, and we'll talk to you soon. Be lawful, not awful, law enforcement, and the rest of you guys out there, make smart choices.
Yeah, we cut through the noise, no script, no leash, no polished decoys, broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise, no script, no leash, no polished decoys, broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise, no script, no leash, no polished decoys, broadcasting without permission. We